Kilkenny. How are your horse? I heard that's the way to say hello. I learned it last year, and I'm happy to do it again. I think Mark is somewhere in the audience. It's thanks to him. I'm really happy to be here in Kilkenny. Don't tell anybody, but this is one of my favorite conferences all year round, so huge shout out to Richie and Sinead and the team. The conversations I have here always influence what I do and also what I'm thinking about going forward in terms of generative AI. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to talk through what we found are key blockers and opportunities for generative AI adoption. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach to one of the biggest gaps that exists right now in terms of AI adoption, which is the trust gap, building on what Lorna was sharing in the great panel that she facilitated right before me. And then lastly, talk a little bit about what do we see coming down the road? What's next in terms of 2025 and generative AI? And then lastly, because you'll forget 99% of this presentation at the end, which is why there's lots of videos and fun pictures, I will leave you with 3 key takeaways that I want you to walk out of this room and remember. So, right now, there's a lot of conversations around data center infrastructure and investment in data center construction. But we really need to understand that actually infrastructure is in fact just the beginning of a digital transformation journey. And there are some really interesting things that we're seeing with the increase in capability, connectivity, and alignment in trends related to generative AI adoption. The first trend that we're seeing is that actually AI uptake in Europe is outpacing the adoption of mobile phones in the early 2000s. What does that mean concretely? It means that 5 businesses in Europe are adopting AI per minute. That's nearly 3 million businesses alone in the last year. 42% of businesses are actually now consistently using AI. This is up from a much lower percentage in 2024. And in 2023, and actually a lot of these businesses are reporting very concrete revenue gains alongside productivity and efficiency gains. But we're actually, in reality, just at the beginning. And we're seeing already, and I've loved hearing from a lot of customers that are here today, the ways in which generative AI is fundamentally changing the ways we think about, for example, precision medicine, the future of cybersecurity, the future of agriculture, of personalized education and learning, of finance, and Scott was talking about this in the previous panel, they're early adopters we're seeing right now of generative AI. And lastly and fundamentally, the ways in which we can collaborate and connect with each other. But in parallel to this unbelievable enthusiasm around AI adoption, there's actually a 2-tier AI economy that we're seeing beginning to emerge. And this manifests in 3 different ways. The first is the gap between adoption of startups and large enterprises. So startups, and it will come as no surprise to many of you, are leading the way in AI adoption. 37% of startups are actually developing new products, compared to only 17% of larger companies and enterprises. What we're seeing is that 42% are using the technology to actually drive business innovation, compared to only 17% of larger enterprises. So again, what this underlines in terms of an urgency of the trend that we're seeing is that there's a need to move from fundamentally productivity and efficiency gains and revenue increases to operational transformation, and then lastly, fundamentally, to strategic reinvention. How do we integrate AI and move from a kind of, and it came up in the previous panel, this POC purgatory, where there are lots of proof of concepts, but not necessarily a translation of these proof of concepts into transformational innovations that can scale and that can fundamentally transform large enterprises, but also enterprises of all sizes. The second thing that we're seeing is a gap between private sector versus public sector adoption. And this is something that's really important in terms of the gap that exists that fundamentally could change and accelerate the ways in which we're adopting AI across industries, because fundamentally, public sector adoption inspires others, because it inspires trust necessary in this technology. So in a report that we recently commissioned, we found that actually 78% of businesses are more likely to adopt AI if the public sector leads the way. And almost half of people that we talk to view AI more positively when it's adopted by the public sector. And I just want to share 3 very concrete use cases, because I was part of the AI Action Summit in Paris that brought together many members of Ireland and companies from Ireland as well. And there was a notable shift between conversations around misuse of the technology towards misuse of the technology. What does this represent as a missed opportunity if we're not adopting AI across different organizations and industries? And I want to share 3 examples that are particularly close to my heart. This man is James Roy McCary. He's my father. He is from County Cork, and he, until the last day of his life, was convinced of 2 things. One, that Ireland has the best rugby team in the world. And the second thing is that he didn't understand the internet. So he didn't understand email, or that I didn't need to go to a post office to send something to somebody. When I first showed him video streaming, he asked me if the woman of the music video was going to come out of the screen. So no IT tech expertise. But my 94-year-old father was using a generative AI chatbot put out by the French government with the support of AWS to actually access his Social Security benefits and his tax. He did not understand how to find this information online, but a generative AI chatbot allowed him to be closer to what he needed, which is information from the government, but also allowed the government to deliver on their fundamental mission, which is to be closer to citizens. The second example that I think is an inspiring one is work that we've been doing with the government of Spain that we've scaled across the European Union. So one of the biggest problems every summer is questions of wildfires. And actually, we've been working with the government of Spain to deploy AI to detect and meditate possibilities of wildfires with 80% accuracy. So it means that this is saving hundreds of families and hundreds of homes on a yearly basis in places like Spain, but also in places like Greece and Italy, where wildfires every summer, because of climate change, are becoming a real issue. It's something that we've deployed also for disaster risk preparedness response for things like floods in Slovenia. And we see very concretely the ways in which AI, coupled with digital twins, can again help the government deliver on their promise to keep their citizens informed and also safe. And then lastly, we have actually worked with the European Parliament and Anthropic to develop a chatbot to help people and policymakers understand what's come before them. So I'm sure many of you have read the Draghi report, which came out at the end of last year, which talked about how there are more than 100 tech regulations in the EU. And we'll circle back to this a little bit later, but a lot of companies, and policymakers, in fact, have a hard time understanding what's regulated by what has worked before, and how can we build better policies that are more inclusive and that promote innovation. And so this chatbot actually lets you go through the history of policymaking processes at the EU level so that we can develop more data-driven, inclusive policies that help unlock opportunities related to digital transformation. And then lastly, in terms of the 2-tier economy that we're noticing, there's a huge gap between tech-native versus non-tech-native companies. Why does this matter? Fundamentally, non-tech-native companies are lagging in adoption, but actually, oftentimes, it's traditional industries that can benefit the most. And I want to share an example and a voice of an innovator that has actually, in the agriculture sector, and out of his own personal need as a farmer, developed a solution in Italy that has actually scaled to more than 100 countries around the world.
Nel 2017 cercavo una soluzione tecnologica per gestire l'azienda agricola della mia famiglia. Ho scoperto che i fornitori esistenti non erano adeguati a soddisfare le esigenze della piccola azienda agricola europea. Così, insieme ai miei cofondatori, abbiamo sviluppato X-Farm per colmare questa lacuna. Supportiamo oltre 500.000 di aziende agricole in più di 100 paesi, coprendo oltre 7 milioni di ettari. Con AWS siamo stati in grado di espanderci rapidamente e di archiviare ed elaborare in modo sicuro enormi quantità di dati agricoli. L'intelligenza artificiale su AWS sta permettendo a X-Farm di aiutare gli agricoltori a identificare le malattie e a trovare modi per controllarle. Utilizzando un modello predittivo, gli agricoltori possono essere avvisati giorni prima che una malattia si sviluppi. L'AI viene utilizzata anche per monitorare la popolazione di insetti, in modo che gli agricoltori possano fare previsioni su quali insetti potrebbero visitare il loro terreno, aiutandoli a proteggerli meglio. Collaborando con AWS, continueremo a espandere la nostra piattaforma per promuovere un futuro agricolo più sostenibile.
So a more sustainable future that's powered by AI and that stays human-centered, I think that's something that all of us in the room want, but in reality, there exists, in addition to the two-tier economy that I shared with you that we see emerging, 3 very fundamental barriers to AI adoption. And these 3 fundamental barriers have come up in conversations that I've had with many of you in the room yesterday and this morning, and I want to share them with you. The first is a digital skills emergency. So actually 40% of businesses that we talked to in the report that we launched says that a lack of digital skills actually stops them from adopting AI. So companies of all sizes are coming to us and they're saying, look, we know the business challenge, we have the technology, but we actually don't have the people inside of our company to be able to develop the solutions that we need. And it's one of the reasons why we launched our AI Ready initiative, because we actually found that companies know that there's a digital skills gap, but at the same time, employees know that they're interested in learning, but they say some of the biggest barriers to them learning is that they don't have the time and that classes are expensive. And so we launched a series of more than 80 classes that are available for free and that are self-paced to make sure that people can have the skills necessary to participate in the future, which is going to be AI-enabled. Interestingly, in the research that we conducted, we found that the people who were most interested in learning new skills were people who were close to retirement. What that means is that people who are close to retirement understand that their ability to interact and proactively participate in the world of tomorrow actually depends on their capacity to engage in the digital sphere. And so this is the reason why we made these classes available for free, but it doesn't stop there in terms of the massive open online courses. And I want to just share with you 2 initiatives in Ireland that are particularly important in this space. This is Emmett Kelly. Emmett Kelly comes from Tallaght. Emmett Kelly was a car mechanic. He grew up in the neighborhood where there is several of our data centers. And Emmett Kelly participated in a program that we do in cooperation with the Technical University of Dublin to train data center technicians. And he now is in a data center working as a technician. He was part of a cohort with another man named Adam Gabarov. Adam Gabarov was a refugee from Chechnya who used to be a security guard in one of our data centers. He said, oh, the data center technician program, that looks interesting. He passed it. He's now a data center technician in one of our data centers in Ireland, and he's actually training to become a network engineer. So this represents an enormous opportunity in terms of how we think about what do we need to reimagine in terms of the future of education so that people are participating in this revolution and not just watching it. It's one of the reasons why we launched a program called EdTips in Ireland, which in cooperation again with TU Dublin, makes available digital kits inside every primary school inside of Ireland, because we understand that we have to start young. It was just International Women's Day. There are many women in the room today. One of the major reasons why women are so underrepresented in the tech sector is they are not encouraged from a young age to pursue careers in ICT, or they think that to pursue a career in the tech sector, you need to be an engineer. This is not the case, and this is one of the reasons why we've launched this program alongside many other programs that I invite you all to check out that really focus on providing personalized education online, but also working with partners on the ground to make sure that we have in-person education from everything to cloud, to AI ML, to data center operations. I'm so happy to see so many people in the room taking pictures of this slide. If you're interested, please feel free to come up to me and talk after this session. I promise I don't bite, and also happy to share more information around the courses that we have available. So first blocker, digital skills. Second blocker is a lack of regulatory clarity in the EU. In the next year, businesses that are unclear about regulation actually intend to invest up to 28% less in artificial intelligence because they're concerned that they will be fined. In tandem, 68% of businesses that we surveyed in the EU said that they actually don't understand their obligations under the EU AI Act. I was on a panel on Tuesday, in Amsterdam, and general counsel of a customer of ours said, you know what's really good to understand your obligations under the legislation and the interaction between the EU AI Act, the GDPR, and the EU Copyright Directive? Claude. But we can't just rely on generative AI to understand our legal obligations in the EU AI Act, and more in terms of interplay with other existing legislation. So regulatory clarity is absolutely essential, not only because it helps everyone move faster. It's like having a driver's license. When you have clear rules of the road, you can move quickly and drive both safely and very, very fast. But at the same time, it's a business imperative to have regulatory clarity. Because in the research that we conducted, what we found is that organizations are spending around 40% of their IT spending on compliance-related questions. That percentage goes up to 45 or 50% for startups. So imagine if you're trying to navigate moving pieces of a puzzle of a regulatory environment in the EU when a lot of companies in Ireland don't just want to be, for example, Irish champions or European champions. They want to be global champions. And so one of the things that we've emphasized is the need to make sure that there is regulatory clarity and that there are international standards that help companies scale at the international level. This is one of the reasons why a lot of the companies that we talked to said that the digital single market is actually one of the reasons why they view Europe as competitive, because it allows amazing startups that are here today in Ireland to scale with clarity in places like Germany, Spain, Italy, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and elsewhere. One of the things that we've centralized at AWS is the conviction and the need that we share with decision makers and policymakers to bring everybody around the table. So as human beings, what we don't understand, we're afraid of. And the reality is that a lot of people don't understand what artificial intelligence is, and I would say is not, as a technology. And so policymaker education is just as important as education of citizens, but we really need to make sure when we're thinking about how to regulate that we're bringing scientists, that we're bringing startups, that we're bringing industry and civil society and academia around the table so that policies protect fundamental rights, but also promote innovation. And it's something that we've been doing with our customers, and if any of you are interested here today, please again come and talk to me after this call and talk over drinks, because one of the things that we're committed to doing is amplifying the voices of the innovators on the ground that are interested in shaping the future of European tech. Because actually it's only when everybody's speaking with each other that we can end up with policy frameworks that protect the fundamental rights that we support and that also promote with clarity innovation. So this is an all-hands-on-deck moment, and we see that in the third and last blocker that I'll share with you today, which is funding and investment. So more than half of startups actually say that access to venture capital and government incentives helps them to grow faster. And again, more than half say that government grants or funding helped them the most in adopting AI. So again, it shows the role of government and the public sector in inspiring trust. But in order to do that, they need to be leaders in adoption, and they also need to be investing in the innovators on the ground that are going to be shaping the social and economic future of their countries. It's one of the reasons why we invested more than $1 billion in cloud credits for startups developing generative AI solutions in 2025, with the conviction that there's lots of people who have really great ideas on the ground, but that probably don't have a background in AI. And so one of the things that we've been doing is identifying through our AWS Generative AI Accelerator opportunities to identify these great ideas and bring them to the forefront. So we've actually identified across Europe, Middle East, and Africa 18 startups that incubated these great ideas that we're accompanying in translating these ideas into AI-empowered opportunities. So 3 blockers that I want you to remember: digital skills, regulatory uncertainty, and funding and investment. But I want an optimistic note in this conversation that we're having to say that there are ways to actually overcome the barriers that exist. And we're convinced that infrastructure is the beginning, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, but is not the end. So we need to invest and continue to invest in infrastructure, but we also need a pro-growth regulatory environment and the modernization of public sector technology.
The story of a farmer named Mikhail,
This is another
who
story.
has a small holding which is next door to one of Ukraine's largest pig farms. After the full-scale invasion started in 2022, the majority of the pigs actually starved to death, and then the ones that didn't were later killed by stepping on landmines. His family actually ran out of food in 3 months after the invasion started. Halo is currently clearing Mikhail's land so that he can return to farming. Some farmers in his position decide that they can't afford to wait and decide to farm their land anyway, with often tragic consequences.
I love this story of Halo Trust because at the end of the day, citizens that aren't working in our field, the first question that they ask us is, why should I care? How does this impact at the end of the day my life, my economic independence, and my family? And the story of what the Halo Trust is doing with Mikhail, this farmer in Ukraine, and the ways in which this work has actually allowed him to be able to farm again in a safe way and to feed his family, I think is an exemplary reason of why we need more public-private cooperation that modernizes public sector technology, but that also allows us to fundamentally impact and save lives on the ground. And then lastly, accelerating private sector digital adoption by addressing those gaps in the two-tiered economy and the blockers that I mentioned earlier. There is, however, fundamentally, no matter what size company you are, no matter which sector you're working in, and no matter where you're working in Europe or beyond, a fundamental transversal blocker, and it's the trust challenge. As I mentioned, as human beings, what we don't understand, we're afraid of, and it starts with education and understanding the technology. But there's a lot of concern that the fact that generative AI is becoming more pervasive. So around 84% of organizations that we talk to consider responsible AI as a top management issue, but actually only 25%, in fact, have processes in place or governance mechanisms to actually address it. And this is a problem for 2 fundamental reasons. One is that adoption is happening whether or not companies and organizations know it or not. At the beginning of the generative AI boom, I will plead guilty of, without a kind of framework and generative AI policy, using my telephone to use a generative AI model to figure out information of things that I wanted to know in a quicker way at work to drive my efficiency and productivity. Your employees are using generative AI, whether you know it or not. If you don't have a policy in place, they're using their telephones, they're copying what comes out as an output on their telephones, they're sending it to themselves on their email. Sometimes they're inputting confidential data, sometimes they're inputting IP. So the need to develop confidential frameworks for governing the use of generative AI in your companies is an absolute imperative. And that's where responsible AI frameworks comes into place. It's an imperative not only because it's the right thing to do, but actually from a business perspective, responsible AI approaches in companies of all sizes drives and doubles the profit impact of your organizations. So it is a business imperative to develop and translate principles into practice. And we're doing that through 4 different ways. One is that, and I talk to policymakers on a regular basis, if you talk to policymakers and you say, oh, do you think transparency, explainability, privacy and security, are these important principles for us to consider in our work? Every single decision maker and policymaker in the world will say yes. But if you talk to an engineer and say, oh, can you embed explainability, transparency, privacy, and security into the algorithm you're developing, they'll say, what the hell are you talking about? How do you want me to do that? And so a lot of our work is actually focused on translating the principles that fundamentally guide the ways in which we design, develop, and deploy AI technologies into actual practice. But there are different responsibilities for different parts of the value chain. So designers will do one thing, developers will do another, deployers will do another. And I invite you all to check out the guidelines that we've published that really dive deep into what do these principles actually mean for the everyday designer or AI/ML engineer or coder. And that's a huge emphasis of the work that we're doing. The other element is really integrating responsibility throughout the AI lifecycle, because we're convinced that responsibility isn't the responsibility of one person. Responsibility is the responsibility of everyone. Thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, education. So one of the things that I love about the classes that we've developed is that it's not based on the idea that everybody is going to be an AI/ML coder tomorrow. Everybody is not going to be an AI/ML coder tomorrow. But everybody will be interacting, and I would say already are interacting, with AI. And so you need to understand what it means to develop and deploy, and above all, use these technologies in a responsible way. So we've developed a series of classes dedicated to questions around bias, fairness, and responsible AI that target non-tech audiences that we think are really important, because in reality, my 18-year-old daughter is interacting with AI every day she goes to school. She wants to be a prompt engineer without telling you how old I am. That did not exist as an option as a career when I was at university. And so the ways in which we are thinking about the future of how our children are going to work is directly influenced by their capacity to proactively shape this sector. And so the education piece is really important. And then lastly, advancing the science. One of the things that we're seeing is that the development of the technology outpaces any regulatory framework that exists in the world. That's not going to change. And so advancing the science behind this technology is really important when you think about frameworks for example, safety. And we recently launched in February our Frontier Model Safety Framework, which really looks at the combination between how can we use state-of-the-art science to advance the ways in which we can make sure that our tools and services are safe and secure. These are the pillars that guide our work on responsible AI. If you're interested in diving deeper, we have a lot of resources that are available online. But the umbrella that actually houses all of these different principles is the question of governance. So my call to all of you today would be, if you do not have models in place for governance, please come and talk to us. We'd love to have a conversation with you about what that looks like. I mentioned that responsible AI is everybody's responsibility, and with that conviction, I want to talk very briefly about where do we go from here and what we're seeing to close up as trends. So first trend that we're seeing in terms of the adoption of generative AI is more and more conviction that the workforce of tomorrow is mission-driven. So I loved the panel that preceded my talk, because one of the things that's really important to think about is why are you innovating? To address what challenge and why AI? Sometimes it's going to be AI, sometimes it's going to be a different technology. But focusing on impact and working backwards from there is very important. When I talk to customers, they talk about the question of responsibility and trust, but they also talk to me about their concerns with regards to environmental impact and sustainability. And so we're seeing now a new era of energy efficiency that's driving innovation. And it's one of the reasons why we continue to innovate at the infrastructure level in terms of our chips, but also in terms of the ways in which we design our data centers through our data center energy efficiency improvements. Technology tips the scale in the discovery of truth. Many of you will have seen a lot of the concerns that existed during the year of elections around misinformation and disinformation. One of the things that excites me the most is the ways in which AI can be used to actually address the challenges related to AI itself. And we are one of the first companies to harness AI to watermark our audiovisual generative AI content. This is something that we're seeing more and more emphasis on in order to understand when we're consuming information, what is the source of that information? And AI provides a lot of really great opportunities. Open data drives decentralized disaster preparedness response. It circles back to what I was sharing about the work that we've been doing with the government of Spain that has scaled. Open data is a key component to the ways in which we could democratize access to innovation, but also to information. And what we're seeing already in 2025 is a huge uptake of open data and AI commons. And I was really happy to hear from Hugging Face in the previous panel as one of the leaders in this space who we're happy to partner with on questions related to open source. Intention-driven consumer technology takes hold. People consume technology that they can trust. And so this question of responsibility by design and how we move from an approach of responsibility that's bolted on to built in to by design is going to be one of the biggest conversations in 2025. And then last but not least, agentic AI and the next frontier in computing. Many of you will have seen the announcement that we made internally of our new organization dedicated to agentic AI. And this is one of the things that we're seeing first and foremost is the opportunities that this innovation represents going forward. So to close, I want to leave you with 3 key takeaways. If you leave this room, remember these 3 things. The first is that I think that there is a fake debate that exists right now choosing between responsibility and innovation. When the reality is that responsibility and innovation need to go hand in hand. Because fundamentally, responsibility drives the trust necessary that will drive the adoption that will ultimately lead to a new wave of innovation that unlocks social and economic opportunity for all. Cloud-enabled AI adoption could unlock more than 433 billion euros in additional GDP before 2030. So it's an economic imperative, but it's also a social imperative. We heard it in Tim Willoughby's talk this afternoon. We'll hear more about innovations and things like IVF later today. This is a social imperative. Second takeaway, good AI needs good data. But fundamentally, good data needs good AI. But good work needs good people. So to all of you in the room today, many of you will know that AI literacy is an obligation under the AI Act. I would encourage you all to invest in your people so that they can be part of the production of AI solutions of tomorrow. And then lastly, that the future is tech-enabled and human-centered. There's a lot of concern and conversations around AI replacing human beings. AI will complement our human creativity so that we can co-create this future that is tech-enabled and human-centered going forward. And we look forward to continuing to collaborating with you to incubate these ideas into impactful action. Thank you very much.